Hello, welcome to the episode in the Let Fuel Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is June 19th, 2023, and I'm delighted to have on another person who continues to be at the front line of liberty thinking and making sure that we have a more prosperous future, and it's none other than Dr. Michael Munger. Michael, welcome to the Let Fuel Prosper show.
It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Well, it really is a pleasure to have you on, and I've been listening to you for a number of years on Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. I think you said earlier you've been on for 45 times, so it's really a pleasure to have you on, and you've had your own podcast, which we'll get into that in just a minute now. Let me start off with, for the audience, give a little bit of your background, and then we can get right into it. So, Dr. Michael Munger is professor of political science and director of the PPE certificate program. His primary research focus is on the functioning of markets, regulation, and government institutions. He has taught at Dartmouth College, University of Texas, and University of North Carolina, as well as working as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission during the Reagan administration. Munger is a past president of the Public Choice Society, an international academy society of political scientists and economists with members in 16 countries. He was a North American editor of the journal Public Choice for 5 years and is now a co-editor of the Independent Review. His recent books include Choosing in Groups and Tomorrow 3.0. The most recent book is The Sharing Economy. It's published in 2021 by the Institute for Economic Affairs. And we also have this one. It's Capitalism Sustainable, which we'll talk about some today. So as we go through all of this, I know you could talk about a number of topics, and so we'll hit on some key ones. But first, I would like to start off with, why do you do what you do each and every day?
Well, first, thank you. Let me summarize that introduction. This guy's really old. He's had a bunch of jobs and he can talk about anything. I suppose that's all too accurate. I'm ashamed. I have been interested in the problem of why it is that some nations are more prosperous than others, and why some states are more prosperous than others for a very long time. And the reason is that I studied with an economist named Douglas North, who in 1993 won the Nobel Prize, but I worked with him long before that, so we're back to the old part. But the question that Doug always asked was, it looks like you should be able to copy the institutions that we all basically know lead to economic growth. And the two big ones are a system of rule of law with an independent judiciary and a set of property rights that are enforceable and predictable. And the second is a set of institutions for reducing the transactions cost of impersonal exchange, a monetary system, a financial system for making loans, and a process for exchanging capital that may not take physical form. So you actually have to have financial capitalism. If you have those two things, or let me put it this way, every nation without exception that has those two things has prospered and grown. And recently, China, which doesn't really have a full financial sector, they are capital constrained, they've still grown like crazy. So the question is, why aren't all nations prosperous? Because prosperity, unlike power, is something we can all share. Now, if one country has a lot of power, it means other countries don't. But if one country has a lot of prosperity, all the others can have it too. And that's why I'm in favor of prosperity. I'm not really that worried about inequality. I want to solve the problem of poverty. And so many of my friends on the left see wealth as a zero-sum game. They see it as, if there's somebody wealthier than I am, I must be worse off. Why don't we all prosper? And so that's why I get up in the morning, is I worry about the problem of prosperity as the only solution to poverty.
Well, amen. And I agree with you. And that's why I do this program on the Let Fuel Prosper show, is to talk about that. And I'm glad you brought up Douglas North. He's one of my favorite economists, talking about institutional economics and, looking at social, economic, and political institutions and how they come together and the interaction of those, to draw kind of a Venn diagram with 3 loops and how they all come together in that special point where you bring about more capitalism, more freedom, more prosperity. But it goes back to those private property rights that you mentioned before. One of the things that I think that you so eloquently talk about is our transaction costs. What about transaction costs? Why do they matter so much?
Again, I have to blame Doug North. So you went through a PhD thesis defense. It makes you pretty scared. So at my PhD thesis defense, which was before you were born, as you already pointed out, I'm really old. At my thesis defense, Douglas North asked a question. I was terrified. I didn't know the answer. I went to the board. I started writing equations. Now, that's what economists do when they don't know the answer, but it's also what we do when we think we do know the answer. So you can hide behind writing those equations. After a while, Doug raised his hand and said, Michael, stop. And then he said in a voice that you might use to address a well-loved but not terribly bright child, the answer is transaction costs. Because for Douglas North, the answer to every question was transaction costs. And so why is it that some nations prosper and others don't? Is it a lack of entrepreneurship? No, in fact, if you look at poor countries, everybody's an entrepreneur. Everybody is a side hustle. Most people don't have jobs in the traditional sense. There's plenty of entrepreneurship. What there isn't is the opportunity to turn entrepreneurship into value, which turns into income. And the reason is that the nation puts up transaction costs in the form of impoverished financial institutions and political corruption, where if I want to do something good for the country, I have to pay off some darn bureaucrat for the privilege of benefiting the country by increasing its income. So I think that's a reductionist approach, but having a podcast that always takes that perspective, the reason I did that is a lot of times people don't recognize, if you just think, if your first response to a hard problem, here's something I can't solve, think to yourself, isn't the answer just transaction costs?
That's right. That's right. And you have this podcast now. You've been doing it for a little bit of time. What's the name of the podcast again, just for the audience?
The name of the podcast is The Answer is Transaction Costs.
Yes. I love it. And you've already had some good episodes on there, so I hope the audience will go out, subscribe to that one as well. And you're right. I mean, Douglas North is right as well. Is that it comes back to
Douglas North was right.
There you go.
Hear it.
That's right. Yeah. and I should say, we were talking about this before we went on to record, but in 2010, I went to a IHS, Institute for Humane Studies, Scholarship in a Free Society, and you were there along with others, Peter Bedke, Steve Horowitz, other great ones. And you really got me interested in public choice economics. So for better or worse, that is the case now. And so I went on this path of James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, Douglas North, and others. And what really also caught my eye was, economic freedom. You have economic freedom of the world, economic freedom of the states. I've worked a lot with the state policy think tanks across the nation. The Fraser Institute has one. There's others that are out there. But you see this correlation between increasing economic freedom and increasing per capita GDP, other measures, life expectancy. I mean, it's not just about prosperity. This is something I talk about, Michael, on the show, is that I'm for let people prosper, but I believe that that's not just from freedom that comes with material prosperity, that it's also intellectual prosperity, it's spiritual prosperity. It's so much more, because you have the freedom and the liberty to do that within those systems. But I wonder what you think about prosperity overall.
One of the things that's interesting is that many economists take prosperity as the thing to be explained. And it seems like poverty ought to be the thing to be explained. Now, I can understand why they would do this. The reason that most people in the world are poor is that it is difficult to organize the emergent structures that allow us to help each other. But the fact is that a market system creates not just incentives, it also provides the information that we need to create the emergent structures that allow us to help each other. And maybe it's firms, maybe it's a farmer's market where you can go and be secure. Maybe it's a nonprofit organization. Maybe it's a church group that is providing a soup kitchen for the poor. But all of those things are groups of people who are coming together voluntarily to say, how can we solve this problem? Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America in 1831, said that he worried that a democratic state where you're supposed to vote and do things through government impoverishes the impulse that all human beings have to associate and solve problems. And he thought that America was the great hope, because in France, he saw democracy was impoverishing this desire. So I would see a school and it's falling down, the students aren't doing well. And I would say the government should do something. But in the US, I see that, and a group of people, maybe a church, maybe a county, say, we should do something. We have the power to change this. And if the nanny state convinces us that it's the only source of help and organization and financing, then we have lost something essential about our ability to solve these problems. So that, I think, is the public choice perspective. It's not anarchistic. Public choice is politics as exchange. There are many ways that we can come up with new organizational forms to help each other. Not all of them are markets. Many of them are voluntary private organizations and nonprofits.
Yes, yes. And one of the insights, I think, from public choice compared to other schools of economics was the insight about politicians also work with at the margin. I think oftentimes we hear about the private economy, individuals working at marginal cost, marginal benefits, and everything else, and somehow assume that these politicians are angels and that they have all information. They're omniscient.
Geniuses, right? Angels and geniuses.
Yeah, they're omniscient, and so they can make all these decisions for the marketplace. And Hayek did a great job of highlighting the knowledge problem. But I think Buchanan and others talked a lot about they have different incentives, but the same marginal cost and marginal benefits. It's just that one of their cost and benefits that they consider is winning re-election. Right? Winning votes in the process. But I wonder how you would explain it.
This is, in a way, a segue to my own experience. I ran for governor of North Carolina in 2008. North Carolina has really restrictive ballot access laws. And so people ask, why would you run? Well, the answer is that the Libertarian Party, I ran as a Libertarian, the Libertarian Party had run for governor 8 times, and it cost $250,000 in order to get enough signatures to be on the ballot. So 8 times we had spent all of our resources to get the signatures and then arrived breathless at the starting line, unable to compete in the election. And of course, the D and the R, they show up, they're tanned, well rested, they're ready, and they've got a fundraising machine behind them. So North Carolina law said that if the governor candidate can get 2% in the general election, that means you are automatically ballot qualified. And I was arrogant enough to think that I could do that. I got 2.8% because I spent a lot of money during the summer when no one is spending money in a political race, trying to get my polls up to the point where I would get invited to the debates. So I was in 4 televised debates with the other candidates. And in some ways, I'm their worst nightmare. I have a PhD in economics, I have a certain superficial glibness, and I have no chance of winning. And so I could answer the questions. And a number of people said, even the campaign manager, one of the candidates said privately, you won the debate, but you don't understand what this is about. And that was the main thing that I learned from this experience, was the job of the 2 candidates from the state-sponsored parties was not to answer the questions. So I would answer a question and they would each repeat some memorized nonsense because they knew that they were going to target their base with money that was going to be used for ads. Now, if then you think that politicians are angels or geniuses, you have to realize that, well, 2 things. First, the sort of people that are going to be willing to not answer questions, not take policy positions, and not actually work for the things that they care about. And the second is to have policy positions dictated to them by moneyed interests. If those are the 2 things, if that's how we select candidates, they're not geniuses and they're not angels.
No, that's exactly right. There needs to be a book titled that at some point.
not geniuses, not angels.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, no, I mean, it's a great experience that you went through. I'm glad that you had that experience and did that. That we need more people.
I think more economics professors should bankrupt a business.
Yeah.
And more political science professors. I teach in the political science department. They ought to lose an election.
There you go.
That now a successful business or win an election, that's a tall order. But if you go out and fail and do it in a fabulous way, you learn so much. And I'm a much better teacher as a result. I learned a ton.
Yeah. You learn through those failures.
But you actually have to do it instead of speculate. I'm drawing demand supply curves on a board. That's not how businesses work.
No.
If you want to know how business works, start one, see what happens.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's kind of a good segue actually into, is capitalism sustainable? Because I think today, a lot of people think that we shouldn't fail, that everybody should be bailed out. We've seen that with the banking sector. We see that in other areas. If you have more than $250,000 in deposits, apparently you can get bailed out now too. It's just one thing after another to where we don't have the failures. And I'm concerned that we're not going to learn our lessons. And in fact, we haven't learned lessons from the past. But capitalism, I would argue, is sustainable. And after reading your book, even more so, that because of the bottom-up approach that is capitalism, through markets, through profit and loss. We got to remember the loss part. These things make it more sustainable than any other institutional framework from an economic perspective that we have so far available. But what say you about this?
I think capitalism is not sustainable.
All right.
In a democracy.
Yep.
And adding that, now, notice that the alternative would be to say, well, let's not have a democracy. That would be taking us in a whole new and interesting direction. I'm a liberal in the classical sense. I'm taking it as a given. I want to live in a constitutional republic where voters choose candidates and we have a bottom-up approach to policy formation. So I'm going to take that as a given. If that's true, then there's three levels or concentric circles. The first is exchange. And in an exchange, both parties are better off if the exchange is voluntary. And that, I think we lose sight of that. The more exchanges you make, the more you make other people better off and the better off you are yourself. The second, slightly smaller concentric circle inside of markets, inside of exchange, is markets, where in addition, you have some financial institutions, you have a monetary system, and you have a judiciary for adjudicating disputes over property rights. The smallest interior circle is capitalism. Capitalism is a system for raising capital. And in fact, I've sometimes said that if you were to make a single one-word argument in favor of capitalism, it would be this: liquidity. Liquidity is a fire hose of new resources that we can direct towards the highest valued use in society. Now, it has become sort of a truism that you can have an afternoon meeting in Silicon Valley, you have lunch, you have a handshake, and now you have $20 million of venture capital or angel capital. That means that you now can try a new business. But wait, if it fails, you lose that money. You don't have Uncle Sugar come and bail you out. However, let's suppose that we have two meetings that afternoon. One is with the venture capitalist, and one is with a lobbyist who is going to the California State Legislature, or is going to go to the House subcommittee on bailing out losers. And that second meeting may be more productive than the first. So if we believe, what I've tried to do, I call this doing public choice on capitalism. Let's assume that corporate managers are rational. They're going to try to maximize profits. At some point, if I've invested enough in plant and equipment and new products and research and development, at some point it's likely to become more profitable at the margin for me to invest in lobbyists and getting favorable treatment from the government than it will be to try to compete the old-fashioned way. Is this illegal? No. Is it immoral? Yes. And so we need to teach, I would go so far as to say Christian character, but character at all would be a big help, where we need to be concerned about the welfare of others. Yeah. So it's not that I'm just trying to maximize profits at any cost. What I have to do is play by the rules of the game, where the only way that I can make a profit is create value for other people where they buy my product voluntarily. What we can do instead is enlist the aid of thugs with guns who happen to have badges and uniforms. And they will then force consumers to pay taxes that go to me in the form of subsidies. That's not a voluntary exchange. And that's the reason that I think capitalism may not be sustainable in a democracy. That temptation is going to attract at least some people who will say, you know, I can make more profits politically than I can economically. And so a lot of our liquidity, a lot of our resources are going to be directed away from profit opportunities and towards rent-seeking opportunities. And I don't see a way around that unless voters rise up and speak as if with one voice and say, no, stop.
Yes, we need that. And I guess a big part of that would be constitutional rules. We need rules in place. So I've been in favor of a spending limit. We've got to do something about this debt and unfunded liabilities and everything else. We just had this debt deal, which really didn't do much. This kicked the can down the road a little bit longer, but it made the politicians feel good. And they go back home and said they didn't default on the debt, even though they're going to issue more, if the Fed's going to print more and everything else. But they can say they did something. But I've been in favor of a spending limit, based on just something like population growth plus inflation or something like that. Just to give you an example, Michael, over the last 20 years, they've increased the national debt by $18 trillion. If they had just matched population plus inflation over that same 20-year period, it would have only been a $500 billion increase in the national debt.
But why would they do that? Why would a rational politician do that if I can take money at gunpoint
sure,
from taxpayers and then use it to buy their vote by giving them back part of it after I hire a bunch of activists? There's no downside to this unless voters punish them for that. I used to write for Rush Limbaugh. And one of the things I actually got Rush Limbaugh a couple of times to say on the air is that U.S. policy is daft. D-A-F-T. Deficits are future taxes. And so I have to say a discouraging word here. I don't think this is a partisan issue. The Democrats have consistently kept spending up. When the Republicans take office, they don't cut spending. What they do is cut taxes. If you cut taxes without cutting spending, so I want to agree with you, we need some way of limiting spending. That's the only thing that matters. If you cut taxes without cutting spending, those are deficits, and deficits are future taxes. So all of those are tax increases. We're just increasing taxes on unborn generations who cannot possibly defend themselves. You ought to be embarrassed.
Yep. I agree. I agree with you. And it's unfortunate because you're right. I mean, it really is the Republicans and the Democrats who are both in favor of deficit spending. I like that.
Well, you can buy votes.
Yes.
I can use spending to buy votes, or I can use tax cuts to buy votes. And they have an unholy bargain where neither quarrels with the other's way of buying votes.
Yes. And, one other thing is I was the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House from June 2019 to May of 2020. And in there, I mean, every day I was talking about, let's limit government spending. Let's cut government spending. Let's limit it to something. I actually got a line in the budget for the president's budget of that we needed to have a spending limit in the future. The problem is that President Trump didn't care about spending because, to your point, he's a populist, like a lot of politicians who wanted to cut taxes while at the same time giving handouts. I mean, you're basically getting both the best of both worlds for what's happening now.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate.
To be fair, all voters want three things. They want more spending, less taxes, and lower deficits. I want three things. I want to lose weight, eat an entire cake, and just watch Netflix.
Yes.
I have all of those things. We need some politician with the, I'll put it nicely, courage to say, you can't have all these things, and the deficit is going to kill us. The fact that we're continuing to have spending out of control and either tax cuts, first thing I would do is raise taxes. If you're not going to cut spending, you have to raise taxes because the deficit is out of control. We would see a pretty big reduction in interest rates and inflation. It was amazing what happened during the Clinton administration. I'm not really a fan of Bill Clinton on most grounds, but on this, when they showed they actually would make difficult, costly choices, there was an explosion of economic growth, and it can happen again. It's not hard.
Amen. Amen. And I think we're ripe for that time. We have so much that I think is holding the American economy back. And this is one area where you could unleash the economic potential. I mean, I think we've gotten so consumed with this idea of Keynesian economics where government spending leads to more economic growth. So we just spend more, we can grow the economy. But it's in GDP. But we forget that there's so much that's coming out of it. I guess, again, transaction cost is that nothing is free here. There's no free lunch in the future.
There's not. I have to, again, have a discouraging word. I'm a libertarian. So the Republicans tell us we can have tax cuts that will pay for themselves. That's not true either. Now, I'm a fan of tax cuts, but only if you cut spending. Yes. If you cut taxes, you cut spending, they will pay for themselves. That's true. But if you just increase the deficit, most of the tax cuts that we've had recently have increased the deficit, maybe not as much as you would expect, because there are supply side effects. That's not wrong.
Yeah.
But nobody cares about the deficit first.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not a supply side economist where they just say, oh, they just all
They're
pay for
not
themselves.
wrong. They're not wrong. It's just not enough. It's not free.
No, I agree. I agree. And you should be cutting spending at the same time. And we see that even at the state level, which is why I love doing policy at the state level as well, because you had, Kansas back in the aughts, Sam Brownback came in, cut taxes, and then they started running deficits. And so they decided, instead of cutting spending, to raise taxes again. And then the media and everyone else said, look, it didn't work. Well, of course it didn't work, because you didn't rein in government spending at the same time. Yeah. And now we have all these states. I mean, there are more than 40 states that have cut taxes over the last couple of years because of all the increase in personal income. So they had this increase in revenue as well, which I think is going to come home to bite them if they don't rein in government spending at the same time.
Yep. North Carolina has done a great job on that. We actually have not increased spending at much of a rate, and a lot of the tax cuts in that case have paid for themselves, but that's because there has been some fiscal discipline in the General Assembly.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that's one of the states that I highlight pretty often, along with Texas. I live near Austin, Texas, and Round Rock. And so you taught at University of Texas for a while?
Yes, I did. It was one of my favorite things being in Austin, although a lot of the UT professors want to live in New Haven, and so they have this little enclave of Yankee bastards.
Yeah,
I lived south of the river, and people would say, there's Texans that live down there. Yes, exactly. I want to be able to go out on my back porch in my underwear and shoot at the power lines and not have anybody complain.
There you go. Exactly right.
That's the Austin life. I don't want to be New Haven. I want the Austin life.
Yes, it's changed a lot now. I don't know when the last time was you've been to Austin, but there's been a lot of changes over time, and it's kind of an interesting place. And what I talk a lot about is how Texas is this, you have blueberries in the sea of red, right? You have Austin, you have Houston, you have Dallas, and their policies, their regulations, their housing regulations. I mean, the Austin prices, and I shouldn't talk too much. I mean, home prices compared to some other states, but in Austin, they're excessively high compared to other places around, especially when you consider a place like Houston, which doesn't have zoning or very little zoning regulations. You can see the differences between the two. Again, I guess, transaction cost here again would come to bite many of them.
Well, the two things I think we need to do as soon as possible is rein in spending at both the federal and state levels and make it legal to build new housing.
Yes.
The only reason housing is so expensive is that in many, many blue cities, it's illegal to build new housing. And their solution, miraculously, is we should have rent control because it's greed. You've got 3 people for every 1 new apartment. And for some reason, it's greed when the prices go up. That just defies logic. Make it legal to build new housing, and the market will start to take care of this. So my motto is, all housing is affordable housing. Just build new housing. And that means that you will not get the gentrification, which is caused by rich white liberals saying they don't want to live near poor people. And so that means that you then get people moving to other neighborhoods instead of doing what would be sensible and building higher density housing in the wealthy neighborhoods that people want to live in the first place. But they have neighborhood defense associations that frankly would make a segregationist blush. The sort of rules that they use, and they actually with a straight face can say, oh no, we're protecting the neighborhood. Yeah, from poor people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That word protection we're hearing that a lot though these days, right? Where we're trying to single out, we're trying to reduce, and their view is they're expanding the marketplace. They're adding competition to the market. We've heard this with trade protectionism, housing protectionism, antitrust, that's a big one right now. Corporate welfare. I mean, all of this stuff that's going on. I have long been talking a lot about, and I believe you have too, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that, we've moved away from capitalism a long time ago. I mean, if you look at the share of these different major sectors of our economy, healthcare, education, transportation, manufacturing, they're dominated by government. It's government spending, it's government regulations. These aren't market forces that are able to do it. Yes, the markets are going to clear, but not to a level that the private sector would have had. It's based on, government intervention in these markets. And so it makes it to where capitalism isn't really given its true ability to provide the prosperity that it otherwise would. But I wonder what you would say.
Well, it reminds me of an arsonist setting fire to a house and then turning on a hose and turning it off and saying, I should get credit for this. The reason our economy is so sclerotic is that there's so many regulations and restrictions and fees and permissions that are required for entrepreneurs to do what comes naturally, and that is create value for other people and allow them to buy it and have me have a chance to make profits. And if it's a bad idea, I have a chance to make losses. It has to be symmetric like that. Well, what we see instead is all of this web of, it's like your arteries just are clogging up. All of this web of restrictions and subsidies that become a substitute for honest capitalism. But the result is that we're seeing growth rates. After a big recession, we used to see growth rates 6-7%. Now we're lucky if we see 2 in real terms. We're really lucky if 2 net of inflation is unheard of. But it's because of the sclerosis of all this web of government actions. And the hard thing about that, the reason I said there's 2 things we should do, cut spending and make it legal to build new housing, is that getting rid of this web of regulations will be much harder. That I think is a really difficult task. Cutting spending alone will not be enough because you don't have to spend much on stupid laws. It's very expensive to get rid of stupid laws, but it won't show up in spending. But if we get rid of them, it will show up in increased economic activity and prosperity.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so one of the final things I'd like to talk to you about is, look, we had COVID-19, we had the pandemic, we had the shutdowns that took place. I was writing memos internally saying, look, this is a bad idea. We do not need to go down the route of shutting things down. And whenever I left the White House, I was writing op-eds talking about how we're shutting down the entrepreneur and how much better things would have been if we had targeted sort of resources to folks instead of these mass, one-size-fits-all policies that fit very few, if any, people. And then the effects on education and the learning loss by kids. I mean, I think we've done ourselves a disservice for generations to come. This is a major problem.
People on the left are now saying, who knew? Who would have thought that this would have hurt students? I don't know. Everyone?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And others might be saying, well, we should have done more. Remember the Paul Krugmans of the world? We should do more. But whenever I look at this situation, I'm concerned about the precedent that this sets for climate change, whatever the next thing is going to be, that we can have the government come in and tell us what to do, stay home, live in this authoritarian type of a political situation and not have any pushback by very few people overall. And this really concerns me because then we saw the massive spending. Look, we could keep people in their jobs. We can pay them higher unemployment benefits. And I think that's changed people's psyche of whether or not they want to work and kept them on the sidelines for a long period where they're losing productivity and everything else. The entrepreneurship sort of side, we've seen that some in the tech sector where there's more jobs and people opening their own businesses. But in other areas, it seems to be slowing down some. And so I wonder if this has been somewhat of a tipping point in your mind of how do we overcome these obstacles, right? What is the next thing that we can really do? Is it the sharing economy that I know you've written about, or is it somewhere else that we can overcome, that we can really make sure that we can let people prosper?
Well, Vance, I'm really afraid of this because I think we have reached a tipping point. A bunch of things have happened. One, we have the sense that there are forces beyond our control that we need some vast power to help us with. And government is not actually a vast power. It's a bunch of individuals. Maybe they're trying to do the best they can, but they have neither the information nor the incentives to do what needs to be done. The only way that can happen is emergent organizations that come up from people that are trying to figure out voluntary ways to help each other. But the second thing, in addition to sort of displacing our sense of personal responsibility, is that the sharing economy is likely to reduce or eliminate many of the service jobs that until now have provided an outlet for the decline in manufacturing jobs. So in my books, Tomorrow 3.0 and the sharing economy, the phrase that I use is that software is to service jobs as robotics and automation are to manufacturing. So if you go into, let's say, a McDonald's, it used to be you would read some words off the board. Person behind the counter looks at the cash register and would press the buttons that correspond to the words you said. All I have to do is turn the cash register around. You can press those buttons. Now it's on a kiosk. All those people have lost their jobs. I have flown into a number of rental car airports, and then the rental cars, there's nobody that works there. You just get a code on your phone, you punch it in, you get the key, and you leave. So all of these service jobs are disappearing very fast. So the combination of an increased sense of personal helplessness, but also entitlement. Somebody should help me. I don't need to solve this problem myself. Somebody should give me stuff because I'm awesome. And then combine that with there's an actual economic problem where now this is great. From an economic perspective, this is great. The fact that we have a kiosk instead of 2 or 3 people is terrific. It's much cheaper. I don't think working at McDonald's is that great a job. I hope those people go and learn coding. But until we make some progress in the disastrous public school system, I don't know that we have an alternative. So we're coming to a day of reckoning. I think something has changed. And I'm old, as we've established. I've never been more worried. I have never seen a point where I thought capitalism might break.
Yeah, I think you're right. Unfortunately, and it reminded me of there is a McDonald's near Fort Worth, Texas, where there are no workers.
Why? Why would you have workers?
Yep. And you know they're going through it right now to see what that's going to look like as a test sort of situation. But I think we'll get more of them will start to pop up soon, based on profitability and everything else.
Once it's established, once the software is written, it's far cheaper, it's far more efficient.
Yes. And what's interesting too is that those individuals who will be pushing for policies like raising the minimum wage or helping out those workers are hurting those people the most. I mean, yeah, exactly. They got a gun to their head and it's, you know, because the kiosk, for example, who manufactures and who thinks of the kiosk? It's upper income people. Who maintains the kiosk? It's upper or middle income people. They're the ones that are going to get more jobs and more income. You really just have a redistribution of income upward whenever you have these sort of poor policies.
This is one of my pet peeves because this is happening anyway. It will continue to happen anyway, but it is dramatically accelerated by things like minimum wage laws. Dramatically accelerated.
Yes. Yeah, exactly right. Well, you know, I think we could talk all day about this. I know we could. And I hope we will have you back on, Michael, as it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Is there any last words that you'd like to share with the audience about, you know, transaction costs, anything that you'd like to talk about?
Well, if there's only one thing that you remember from what we talked about today, I hope it's that little catchphrase that I got Rush Limbaugh to say, and that's U.S. policy is daft because deficits are future taxes. That is the thing, that a drumbeat that I try to say everything that I write or that when I'm on a podcast, because I think unless we have some grassroots appreciation of the danger we face about deficits and the fact that they are future taxes, we're seeing enormous increases in taxes. Until there is some appreciation of that fact, then we're not serious. All of the other stuff we're doing is a waste of time.
Well, I agree with you on that, and I'll remember to say that as well. Deficits are future taxes. Daft. I like that a lot. Michael, it's really been a pleasure to have you on the show. God bless you and your family, and thank you for being on.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Yes. And for the audience, if you would, please leave us a 5-star rating and be sure to share this episode with all your friends and family. And remember, deficits are future taxes. And until next time, let people prosper.